is an Unspoiled Network podcast.
This is Spoil Me, covering the Vorkosigan Saga Book 2-ish, Barrayar, chapters 7 through 9. In these chapters, Cordelia comes really close to losing the baby. I really thought she was going to. But it might be okay? Maybe? Welcome to Spoil Me. Welcome to the show, everyone. I am Natasha. Thank you very much to Jeff for commissioning this episode. Jeff, if you're out there, appreciate you, buddy. These chapters it was really hard to stop reading here, guys. You all know that, like, having kids and all of that is not something that I've ever particularly wanted. But I know that, and when I say I know, I mean intellectually I know. Not that I really know, because I have never been through this. But I understand how devastating it is when you actually want a child to go through something like this. And I have some close friends who have had miscarriages. And, you know, in some of those cases, they were children that they had actually been really trying for, and that was really rough. And then there were times where it was kids that they weren't even really sure they wanted, but it felt like the choice being taken away from them was somehow, like, just as awful. And that's already when it's like a spontaneous miscarriage, because I think something like 30% of pregnancies end in miscarriage. It's like a really high number. That is a very different thing than what happens in these chapters. And it is so grim. And I was really thinking, I just did not know how this was going to go. And we'll get to the whole, like, details of this thing. But it being a consequence of the decision that Aral makes, that is truly really awful on top of everything else. But first we have another crisis to deal with. Chapter 7 starts off with Aral being like, hey, can you get Kudelka? And his dude being like, I'm so sorry, I guess nobody told you that he is in the hospital. And understandably, Aral assumes that it's something to do with the injury that he already has, and it turns out he was beaten up. And we find out that he was actually out with Bothari, so Bothari also got beaten up, and they wound up killing several people. So it was a big group, like 4 dead, I believe. And they captured a couple of them, so they questioned them later, and we'll get to that whole thing, but what it turns out was going on, Bothari goes out to this whorehouse that is in a really bad part of town. And evidently, Kudelka had wanted to go with him to check and see if shit was working. And it's sort of interesting to me, you guys. And I know that the, like, way that sexuality works can be sort of complicated. So I was sort of under the impression that if you were a guy who wasn't sure if your shit worked, that you could just jerk off and figure out that it worked that way. But maybe he's trying to figure out if it's a different scenario when he's actually with a woman. But they go to this place, and apparently he was matched up with somebody who was not right for him. Bothari has his good time and is waiting for his friend, who it turns out just chit-chatted with this girl the whole time, and then like, she's like, okay, dude, well, you owe me like for 4 sessions. You know that, right? Because you just talked forever. I could have had customers. He didn't want to pay. It became a whole thing. And then when they left, it's unclear if the people who sat on them were related to the whorehouse or if it was just a whole separate thing. The way that the questioning goes later, it seems like it was a separate scenario. But yeah, these dudes like broke his legs backward. Like, you guys, the extent of the violence here is so fucking incredible to me. And the way that this is handled, it's so odd because the first thing that we find out about the roughness of the area, Vorkosigan is explaining to Cordelia it's very poor. And she's like, poor? It doesn't even have electricity. Well, then how is it on the comm network? And Vorkosigan's like, it's not. And she's like, well, then how do people get schooling? And he's like, they don't. Well, then how do they get jobs? A few escape to the service. The rest prey on each other, mostly. Have you no poverty on Beta Colony? Poverty? Well, some people have more money than others, of course, but no comm consoles? It's the first article in the Constitution. Access to information shall not be abridged. Cordelia, these people barely have access to food, clothing, and shelter. They have a few rags and cooking pots and squat in buildings that aren't economical to repair or tear down yet. No air conditioning? Guys, when she said no air conditioning, the way I cackled, it was just such a, like, because air conditioning, it sounds like a luxury, and it is, but if you really stop and think about that, it's fucked up that it is, because plenty of people live in places where heat can kill you, like, just straight up, the heat can kill you, and we act as if air conditioning is just sort of like, well, it's nice to have, but you can live without. No, not everybody can live without it. And even if you can, it's miserable. Why should we expect people to? I have lived in places without AC. In Connecticut, it was awful. I mean, you guys, I just didn't, I got a window unit and I lived in that room all summer. And otherwise the rest of my house, it was like I came out to pee and grab something cold to eat and then run back to my room. And fucking the way that Pyotr responds to this. How do they call for help when they're sick or hurt? What help? Vorkosigan was growing grim. If they're sick, they either get well or die. Die if we're lucky, muttered Pyotr. Vermin. You're not joking. That's horrible. Why, think of all the geniuses you must be missing. I doubt we're missing very many from the caravanserai, said Pyotr dryly. Why not? They have the same genetic complement as you. My dear girl, they most certainly do not. My family have been Vor for 9 generations. How do you know if you didn't have gene typing till 80 years ago? Besides, if you Vor got around half as much as those histories I've been reading imply, 90% of the population on this planet must have Vor blood by now. Who knows who your relatives are on your father's sides? And for Vorkosigan, Cordelia, you can't. You really can't sit at the breakfast table and imply my ancestors were bastards. It's a mortal insult here. You guys. And later on, when the extent of the violence is explained, Pyotr feels very validated in calling them vermin. Pyotr, may I remind you what Cordelia encountered when she was first kidnapped by your people? That was a Vor. But we don't talk about that. What about the fucking prince, my guy? Interesting. Ugh. And what's really rough, you guys, is that this sort of thinking is so much more alive and well than we think it is. It's easy to see this as a sort of antiquated way of thinking or an extreme way of thinking, but truly it isn't. And there are people that you can, like, catch actually saying this shit out loud in public on television. And it is remarkable to me that we are still, as human beings, out here believing this kind of shit. It's such nonsense. And this is like part of the reason why with the rise of Trump and the way that things began to kind of fall apart intellectually in the United States, and a lot of people becoming fucking flat earthers or saying the moon isn't real or birds aren't real, there was a lot of comparison to the film Idiocracy, which, if you are not familiar with, it's a comedy, about what happens. And I'm going to say, like, this is the thesis of the movie. What happens when the poor continue to propagate while the wealthy use birth control and cease having children? Essentially, these idiot poor take over and the whole world becomes stupider. It's really one of the most horrific theses. Like, it's eugenics, you know? It's basically like, we shouldn't let the poor... How about we just give them fucking anything? But no. We have people who are worthy and people who are not. And the people who are not, they don't get to have, like, access to food and shelter unless they go through a rigorous process where they have every aspect of their lives examined, and it is super gross. Like, I have no patience for anybody who talks about cheating the system, because the people cheating the system are the wealthy. The poor, if you're cheating the system, good for you, in my opinion. Go on with it then. I can't care about it. So anyway, this is just super gross. Piotr is a real piece of shit. We find out later just how extensive this is. And it's really interesting and surprising that Vorkosigan has turned out as well as he has, considering who raised him. Anyway, yeah, we get this, the mention of, like, they had some shock sticks. They discovered they could get some peculiar effects on his prosthetic nerves. After they'd broken his legs, they spent quite a long time working him over. That's how it was Commander Ilian's men caught up with them. They didn't clear off in time. Cordelia pushed her plate away and sat trembling. Yeah, that's fucking god-awful. And Piotr was sourly triumphant. Vermin, he asserted. You ought to burn them all out. Vorkosigan sighed. Easier to start a war than finish it. Not this week, sir. God damn. You ought to burn them all out. This man is an idiot. I'm sorry, but there is just nothing that can explain the lack of logic here for me. You are a dink. You are a fucking dodo bird, sir. That's it. So, we have Vorkosigan, who has gone and found out the official report, comes back and is like, are you certain that you want to know what is going on here? And he says, your secretary, it's Ilian who's saying this, was apparently seized with the desire to get laid. Why he picked Bothari as a native guide, I can't imagine. And we get the whole story from him. So, these guys jump them, 6 in front and 6 behind. Like, yikes. And evidently, we wind up finding out that when they saw the weapon, this is so tragic, the weapon that Kudelka had, they all assumed that he was Vor, because they're the only ones allowed to carry something like that. And so, because he is of a class that they clearly feel oppressed by, God, I can't imagine why, they set on him with a particular kind of viciousness. And it's just the fact that she gave him this to defend himself, and it is what gets him jumped in a great... Like, they were going to jump them anyway, but it feels like it was particular here. And they broke his legs backward at the knees. He asked me to tell you it wasn't as painful as it sounds. He said they broke so many circuits he had hardly any sensation. I don't know if that's true. It's hard to tell with Ku, said Vorkosigan. He's been concealing pain for so long it's almost second nature. Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and guess that shit was fucking awful. I feel like that was probably fucking terrible. So, my man who was assigned to Ku followed them down into that warren by himself. He wasn't one of the men familiar with the place, and he wasn't dressed for it. Ku had had 2 reservations for some live musical performance last night, and until 3 hours before midnight, that's where we thought he was going. My man went in there and vanished between first and second hourly checks. That's what has me going this morning. Was he murdered or kidnapped, rolled and raped, or was he a plant, a setup, a double agent? We won't know till we find the body or whatever. 30 minutes after the missed check, my people sent in another tale. But he was looking for the first man. Ku was uncovered for 3 solid bloody hours last night before my night shift supervisor came on duty and woke to the fact. Fortunately, Ku'd spent most of that time in Bothari's old whore's retirement home. So, yeah, this is just... It really doesn't look good for them. Like, this is just a real lapse. And they were able to track them down, and he says, Bothari killed 2, Ku killed 1, and 1 was mine. The kid went into anaphylactic shock and allergic reaction to fast penta, which I'm assuming is a truth serum of some kind. He talks about questioning them under this. And the gang appears to be legitimate Caravanserai Mutual Benefit Society. They decided to pick on Ku because he walked funny. Charming. Although Bothari wasn't exactly walking in a straight line either. None of the ones we captured is an agent for anybody but themselves. I supervised the questioning personally and will swear to it. They were quite shocked to find themselves of interest to Imperial security. And Ilian says that wraps it up except for Ku's motivation for going down there, and he starts to be like, I'm really concerned that maybe he started some shit or did something, and basically is like, concerned is Kudelka betraying us somehow. And Cordelia is like, all right, look, I'm going to tell you something. It's not for the report, but just for your peace of mind. Kudelka is in love with somebody, and he's checking to see if his shit works still. And he's like, oh, who? And she's like, I don't think you need to know that part. I appreciate that being where she cuts it off. And he's like, all right, fine, fair enough. I like the idea that he's just like wanting gossip. So Sergeant Bothari in 5 days is back on the job, doesn't talk about it at all. Drushnikovi asked no questions and offered no comments, but Cordelia saw her occasionally cast a haunted look at the empty comm console in the library. Lieutenant Kudelka returned to curtailed light duties the following month, apparently quite cheerful and unaffected by his ordeal. But in his own way, he was as uninformative as Bothari. Questioning Bothari had been like questioning a wall. Questioning Kudelka was like talking to a stream. One got back babble, or little eddies of jokes, or anecdotes that pulled the current of the discussion inexorably away from the original subject. Cordelia responded to his sunniness with automatic good grace, playing along with his obvious desire to slide over the affair as lightly as possible. Inwardly, she was far more doubtful. If the description of Kudelka doesn't sound like this fucking podcast, I swear to God. And I get it's like completely different motivations. I'm not comparing myself to him, but that cracked me up a little bit. Babble, eddies of jokes, anecdotes that pull the discussion away from the original subject. I was just like, oh no, wouldn't want that. God forbid. Oh God. So she just starts to get really like concerned with the extent of the violence that's happening and how it almost feels like it's sort of ratcheting. She's really worried about her husband and just thinking like, God, if something happened to him, where even would I wind up? Like, I can't go home, could I? Like, I don't even know if Beta Colony would allow me back, which that's a hell of a question. I don't really know what to think of that. So finally, she's in the library, and she is sort of like curled up in this spot that Kudelka comes in and doesn't see her. And he sits at the console for a bit, seeming to do some work, but then he stares into space, gets up, and he begins playing with his sword stick. And I will tell you what, it took me so long to really understand what was going on here. And he is, it really appears, contemplating whether it would be possible to kill himself with the sword. And as he does this, draws a little blood because she gasps, and it like kind of, you know, fucks up his concentration, and he didn't even know there was anybody there. I didn't see you, milady. Don't mind me just fooling around, you know. And she just starts crying. And at first, she's like, I can't do this in front of him. He has enough. I don't need to be putting shit on him. But she is just so deeply upset by this. And he tries to, again, I was just fooling around. And she's like, the fuck you were. And he finally just tells the truth and is just like, you don't know what it's like. Everybody pities me. It's worse to be pitied than scorned, and it's never going to stop. I'm like this forever. It's just going to be like this forever. I hate this place as much as it hates me, more some days. So you're not alone. And she tells him how often she thinks about Aral being killed. And then she says, Ku, no matter how much it hurts, don't do it to him. He loves you. You're like a son to him, just the sort of son he always wanted. That would cut out his heart. This place pours craziness on him every day and demands he give back justice. He can't do it except with a whole heart, or he must eventually start giving back the craziness like every one of his predecessors. And it's so damn wet here. It won't be my fault if my son is born with gills. I just love how she's like as sincere saying that as the other thing. It's not like she just decides to sort of lighten it up with a joke. She's so irritated by it as well as everything that it just comes out as if it's the same level of problem, and it is very funny. And he then is like, are you afraid of childbirth? And she admits, like, your tech is not as good as ours. I'm not feeling great about it. And he admits, like, yeah, I understand that, because he has not been doing super well with these doctors either. And she gives him a hug and wipes the blood off his neck. And she says, when you love someone, it's like your skin covers theirs. Every hurt is doubled. Ugh. The writing, you guys. The writing. I can't. This bitch has so many quotable lines. She has so many, like, I'm just going to go ahead and highlight this one also. I just gotta. So good. And then, and this was something, like, when Owen and I, you know, Owen will just say, I love you, and I'll say, how do you know? Sometimes I'll just respond with, like, why? Or how do you know? Or, you know, just a question. And there was a point when Pippin's brother Sam was doing really badly, and I was really, really upset. Like that kind of frightened and crying where you feel nauseous. And we were driving him to the vet, and Owen said, "You know how I know I love you? When you hurt, I hurt." Basically the same thing. Ugh, you guys. And then it gets interrupted horribly. She says, "I do so love you, Koo. I wish you'd let me help you." And as she says this, "Therapy, Cordelia. I realize you have a great deal of Baton expertise in such matters, but I beg you will leave the project to someone else." Oh. It took me a minute to really get how devastating this line is, because this is being said when Kudelka might be under the impression that folks don't know about what's going on with him in the sexuality department. Maybe he knew, but like nobody's meant to say anything. And this, oh my God, he is such a shit here. I was just like, I love the fact that she follows after him. It's just like, the fuck. And not only does he act this way, but Kudelka is so devastated by this. And she tries to be like, he didn't mean that. And Kudelka says, "I realize I am universally known to be quite harmless to any man's marriage, I believe." God, this is awful. So she's storming after Vorkosigan to yell at him. And Drushnikovi comes in, and she is so irritated that she takes it out on poor Drew. Like, she calls her a useless frill. "Why can't you manage your own affairs? You Barrayar women seem to expect your lives to be handed to you on a platter. It doesn't work that way." I felt so bad for Drew. She didn't deserve this. There is a moment later, though, where we find out that, like, Drew and Kudelka were in his room together, and I was like, maybe she took your advice, lady, and just went ahead and took some matters into her own hands. So Cordelia chases him, and they have a moment of staring, and she's like, "I'm just going to start." And it's like, the fuck are you thinking saying that to him? That is fucked up. And he's like, "What? I come in and you're cuddling him?" And she's like, "That was not what it was." And he, comes back with, "So, it wasn't what it looked like, but you know what it looked like. If I wasn't the one who came in, how do you think this was going to go? Everybody would be talking about it. They're all looking for ammunition. This would be the exact sort of shit that they would love to spread." And she's like, "Oh my God, who fucking cares? We're talking about somebody that you care about hurting, and you just deciding to add to that shit because your ego was hurt." And finally, and oh God, again with another wonderful line that I will be highlighting also. I'm going to just start doing this in this book. "I doubt you could have come up with a more wounding remark if you'd funded a study project." God, that's so good. It's so good, you guys. Oh, it's the sort of thing that makes me go, why am I going to try and be a writer? What's the point? And she's like, "That was foul. What's the matter with you?" And then he sort of like caves a little bit. "I don't know. It's the damn job. I don't mean to spill it on you." Cordelia suspected that was as near as she could expect of an admission of him being in the wrong, and accepted it with a little nod, letting her own rage evaporate. I'll be honest, I don't know if I could have let go of this that easily, but I also really, my first thought when he gets this angry is his wife cheated on him a bunch, and he has a particular sensitivity to that. So I also felt for him, even though he's being unreasonable. I understand that being something that you just, even if you kind of know you're being ridiculous, it is almost out of your hands, your reaction. So her response is like, do you understand the extent of things? And the way she says it, how much do you fancy having to break down his door one of these mornings? And he's like, wait, you think it's that bad? And she's like, yeah, I watched him playing with his sword, trying to figure out how to kill himself. And he kind of shrinks, obviously sort of realizing, oh, cool, the comment I just made is just adding fuel to that. Neato, especially after she just got done being like, he loves you so much, this would devastate him. This whole thing sure doesn't fucking feel like that, you know? And eventually she was bringing up his wife. She's like, yeah, but I'm not her. I'm Cordelia. Forgive me, dear Captain. It's just, I'm an ugly, scared old man, growing older and uglier and more paranoid every day. You too? I take exception to the old and ugly part, though. Pig-headed did not refer to your exterior appearance. These two. So, let's see, the Cetagandans still in good working order. Intelligence indicates they were planning to use the political chaos here to follow Izar Vobara's death to cover a move on those disputed wormhole jump points. Instead, they got me, and I can hardly call it stability. Dynamic equilibrium at best. Not the kind of disruption they were counting on. Hence that little incident with the sonic grenade. Negri and Ilian are now 70% sure it was Cetagandian work. I don't know whether to believe this. I'm not really sure how important it is that we know this either. Who knows? But anyway, he says, like, because she's like, oh, no wonder you've been worried. And he's like, well, not really. Like, this is something that I've known about. And she's like, okay, then what? And he explains that Vorhala's brother has a son who got in a duel, which is illegal, punishable by execution. And it was like a drunken party. They went out with like dull swords. And he's like, apparently he fell and managed to like stab the guy in the stomach and get his aorta and kill him. And it was like a complete accident. But the guy died. It was a duel. And like it started off as a joke, but then it turned into that. And what the fuck am I supposed to do? Like, his father came and was like, can you pardon him? Have it be murder? And she's like, well, that seems fair. And he's like, yeah, but the thing is, I do this favor for him, and then somebody else duels, and now what? Like, how do I draw the line after letting this go? And what if it's like an enemy that comes to me? This guy's part of my party, and if I don't do the same for an enemy, it's going to look a certain way. And I know what it's like when dueling is allowed, and that shit undermined everything about the way our society worked. Like, the whole point of getting rid of it was to stabilize things. And then he points this out, and I really hadn't considered it. He says, and me of all men to have to make that decision who should have been publicly executed 22 years ago for the self-same crime. Which, yeah, like, we know that those guys, apparently, it was considered that they had killed one another, so he just got out of it. Very luckily. But knowing that about yourself, I mean, this is awful for him. And she, like, just counsels him, what you have to do is figure out the kind of principle that you can live by, because you're going to have to be consistent. That's going to be what everybody is looking for. And that's going to be what you cling to when shit is off the rails. And he's like, I know. And she realizes that means he's going to, you know, say that this kid needs to be executed. And she's just clearly so devastated, even though she understands where he's coming from on this. So chapter 8 starts with him getting dressed to go to the execution and her being like, do you have to go? And he's like, yeah, come on, I do. which is particularly terrible when later on we find out that his brother thought Vorkosigan showed up to give a pardon. So this kid got his hopes way up that his brother was going to be allowed to live, and then not only was he executed, it was a messy one. The executioner missed his stroke, had to take 3 cuts to get the head off. Oh, Jesus Christ. His mother cursed me too until Evan and Count Vorhalis took her away. Oh, Cordelia, it can't have been the right decision, and yet no other one was possible, was it? I suppose I better pull myself together and go change. So it takes a while. They're laying together, and he says, I've ordered executions, ordered men into battle. I don't know why this hits like a wall. It stopped me, and I dare not stop or will fall. Gotta keep it in the air somehow. And then they wake up to something crashing through the window, and I was like, really thinking this was going to turn out to be the kid's dad, but it turns out to be his brother. It's a Soltoxin gas grenade, which evidently works slowly to liquefy your insides, which is horrifying. And when she asks, does it cross the placental barrier, he is quiet for a while, and we find out later that he is aware of what the antidote does. And he isn't telling her this now. I am guessing because he is thinking she will refuse the antidote if she knows, which she probably would consider. I don't know if she would. But they wound up catching the person who did it. So he gives her this, and the doctor who brings it, like, they're able to get a hold of the antidote fairly quickly. And this is when the doctor, like, she's like, will the poison affect my baby? And she's like, the toxin isn't the thing, it's the antidote. He calls it a violent teratogen? I'm trying to see, teragidin. Oh, that doesn't sound right. An agent or factor that causes malformation of an embryo, according to the dictionary. And she closes her eyes like as he's mid-sentence. Gets up, Vorkosigan comes over, and they just stare at each other. And Vorkosigan, the blankness of her expression, he's like, you've got to, like, are you going to scream? Are you going to hate me? And she says, I can't feel anything yet. Tomorrow, maybe. So he goes to find out who Kudelka caught. And he's like, you stay here. And she says, no. And she just, he turns like he's going to say, and she understandably is like, I probably lost my child. The fuck I'm staying here. Are you high? And they go down together. You will not, she murmured fiercely, for his ear alone, murder anyone in front of me. Will I not? He whispered back. Will I not? So, they got the prisoner. They turn him around. This is awful. I hate this so much. And I love the fact that when Cordelia sees who it is, her immediate response is, oh, not both of them. It's not, oh, this fucking guy. It's compassion for the fact that this family has 2 sons and now they're going to have none. Which is just such a selfless thing to be thinking in the midst of losing her own child, so it seems right now. Like, that is some next level compassion that I don't know I could muster in the midst of all of this. And this kid calls Kudelka all these different names, or not Kudelka, Vorkosigan, and Vorkosigan gets in and is like, you missed my wife, but you got my son. And this kid finally clocks what is happening here. She had a sense, as of a second sight, that she could see right through his wounded spirit the way doctors saw through a wounded body with their diagnostic viewers. Every twist and tear and emotional abrasion, every young cancer of resentment growing from them, and above all, the great gash of his brother's death seemed red-lined in her mind's eye. He didn't enjoy it, Evan, she said. What would you have had from him? Do you even know? A little human pity. He could have saved Carl. Even then, he could have. I thought at first that's why he had come. Cordelia says, I need to ask him something. Was this the result you intended? I mean, when you chose that particular weapon, that specific poison. He looked away from her, speaking to the far wall. It was what I could grab going through the armory. I didn't think you could identify it or get the antidote all the way from Impil in time. You relieved me of a burden, she whispered. And Vorkosigan explains how he knew what it was and how they got it so fast. And he says, I didn't intend your death particularly. You were just in the way between me and him. It wasn't the result I intended. I meant to kill him. I didn't even know for sure that you shared the same room at night. I never thought about killing your... Look at me. And say the word out loud. Baby, he whispered, and burst into sudden, shocking sobs. Wish you hadn't done that. Reminds me of his brother. Why am I death to that family? Oh, that's awful. Awful, you guys. And he can't pardon him. This isn't the kind of crime that because they lost their son earlier, you can just let him get away with. This sucks. Ugh, I hate it. So, she goes to the hospital, and I am going to summarize this conversation because there's lots of people coming in and out, checking on her and giving her instructions on how to preserve herself. But of course, her child is her main concern. And she finally asks, is there nothing that can be done? And her man says no. I ran a literature search, said the captain unexpectedly, staring out the window, and there was that calcium experiment. True, the results they got weren't particularly heartening. I thought we'd agreed not to bring that up. The residence man glared. Vaughan, that's cruel. You're just raising false hopes. You can't make the regent's wife into one of your hapless experimental animals. And she looks at the man, and I love this. She knew the type. Half right, half cocked, half successful, flitting from one monomania to another like a bee pollinating flowers, gathering little fruit but leaving seeds behind. She was nothing to him personally, but the raw material for a monograph. The risks she took did not appall his imagination. She was not a person, but a disease state. She smiled upon him slowly, wildly, knowing him then for her ally in the enemy camp. Guys, when she goes from like, oh, he doesn't even see me as a person, and then smiles and is like, this is exactly what I needed. I was like, what are you doing, girl? Being like, oh yeah, he's half right, half successful, good enough. Honestly, I guess what have you got to lose? You know, but like, I genuinely was not ready for the final sentence out of that paragraph. So she says, how would you like to write the paper of a lifetime? And the residence man immediately starts laughing and is like, wow, she clocked your ass immediately. Like, he is very impressed with her. And her man says, you should show her pictures of what your idea of results is. No, don't do that. And I was just like, yikes, if he's saying don't even let her see the pictures. Ooh. And he talks about how it did irreparable damage to the mothers. And Vaughan says jellyfish about the fetus. A viable jellyfish? Maybe. But there is the difficulty of what happens to the mothers when the treatment is applied in vivo. So you can't do it in vitro. It would certainly open a number of possible lines of experiment if it could be arranged. And when the residence man is like, what do you even mean? She's like, you have uterine replicators from Beta Colony. Boom. Done. You have to know all about them. And he's like, no, we know they're there, but we're not like using them. We don't have that kind of knowledge or tech here. And says like, we can't do the transfer. You don't advise it then? Definitely not. The possibility of permanent damage. You can, after all, begin again in a few months. If the soft tissue scarring doesn't extend to testicular, you can begin again. And she says, if someone doesn't knock off Aral in the meantime, and we find out that there is a possibility that this drug has affected him and that there was something else, and we'll get there, but that he brings up, like, so the possibility of them being able to try again goes down significantly. So the residence man is like, come on, we can't. This is ridiculous. And Cordelia says, are you ambitious for a research wing? He shrugged, embarrassed rather than outraged, so she knew the residence man's words to be at least half true. You shall have an institute if you can bring this off. You tell him I said so. She just points at Aral. They withdrew. Cordelia lay back on the bed and whistled a little soundless tune, her fingertips continuing their slow abdominal massage. Gravity had ceased to exist. So, Chapter 9. Count Piotr is here to attempt to convince her not to do this. And the reason why is that the child will be born wrong, as he puts it. He's like, there's great damage. If only the fetus were a girl or even a second son, we could afford to indulge your understandable, even laudable maternal emotions. But this thing, if it lived, would be Count Vorkosigan someday. We cannot afford to have a deformed Count Vorkosigan. Cordelia wrinkled her brow. Who is we? House Vorkosigan. We are one of the oldest great houses in Barrayar, never perhaps the richest, seldom the strongest, but what we've lacked in wealth we've made up for in honor. 9 generations of Vor warriors. This would be a horrible end to come to after 9 generations, don't you see? House Vorkosigan at this point in time consists of 2 individuals. You, and Aral and Count Vorkosigan. Counts Vorkosigan have come to horrible ends throughout your history. You've been blown up, shot, starved, drowned, burnt alive, beheaded, diseased, and demented. The only thing you've never done is die in bed. I thought horrors were your stock in trade. But we've never been mutants. So she says the damage he described was teratogenic. I don't know if I'm saying that right. Not genetic. But people will think he's a mutant. What the devil do you care what some ignorant prole thinks? Other Vor, dear. Vor, prole, they're equally ignorant, I assure you. His hands twitched. He opened his mouth, closed it again, frowned, and said more sharply, Count Vorkosigan has never been an experimental laboratory animal either. There you go, then. He serves Barrayar before he's even born. Not a bad start on a life of honor. Oh, man. He calls her cold-blooded, and she's like, this is just rational. And he's like, is it worth it? And she doesn't really have an answer. And they get interrupted by Aral, who is like, she needs rest. You need to get the fuck out of here. And he goes, and we find out later that he tries his luck with the doctors, which is just disgusting and should not surprise me based on how patriarchal this whole culture is, that he thinks that he should get a say. But ew. Ew, ew, ew. Especially weird considering how much he like, and when I say weird, I don't mean like it's inexplicable. I mean, it's ironic, I guess, that he turns on her in this way after being so elated about her pregnancy. The way that he has about-faced on this now is, oh God, what a bummer. So let's see, here it is. She says, I was so afraid for so long, waiting for the blow to fall from somewhere, nowhere, anywhere. Then came last night and the worst was done, over. Except it's not over. If the blow had been more complete, I could stop. Quit now. But this is going on and on. So let's see. Oh, right. Ilian is doing the interrogation with Penta of Evan Vorhalis. He's now investigating the old armory where Evan stole the soul toxin. It appears Evan might not have equipped himself so ad hoc unilaterally as he claimed. An ordnance major in charge there has disappeared, AWOL. Ilian's not sure yet if the man was eliminated to clear Evan's path or if he actually helped Evan and has gone into hiding. And she's like, well, maybe he just was like, just fucked up. And he's like, yeah, well, then running would make sense because he should be fucking afraid. And then they talk about this choice that she's making, and he says that it's her decision, and she's genuinely a little surprised, thinking like, well, don't you want a say? And he's like, whatever you choose, I will support it. And she's like, there's something you're not telling me, though. And he says, I get where my dad is coming from, but I haven't talked to him about one of the other side effects being testicular scarring. It could reduce fertility below the point of no return, or so my examining physician warns me. And Cordelia is like, you just need somatic cells and a replicator to doy. I love the way she's just so used to baiting health and med tech, and she just isn't getting the way this works here. And he's like, well, that's not natural, and we'd have to leave Barrayar. And then she says, or you could change Barrayar. If only I had insisted on using the replicator in the first place. The baby never need be at risk. I knew it was safer. I knew it was there. Shh. If only I had not taken the job, kept you at Surlow, pardoned that idiot. If only we had slept in separate rooms. And the if onlys go on. And then we go into the next section, where she is actually getting operated on. I don't feel the need to go into this in super detail because honestly, I don't really they're having to lift everything complete out of her. And it sounds horrible, but it appears to be going okay. And there's like a pink tinged solution that's like coming out of her, some sort of liquid. And then she starts to feel really cold. And somebody is like, Doc, and is pointing to the monitor. And Ritter is sort of like, clearly something isn't right, but it doesn't seem yet alarming. The fluid trickling over the white dam of her skin changed abruptly from pink tinge to bright, bright red. "Clamp that," hissed the surgeon. Cordelia caught just a glimpse beneath a membrane of tiny arms, legs, a wet, dark head wriggling on the surgeon's gloved hands, no larger than a half-drowned kitten. "Vaughan, take this thing of yours now if you want it," snapped Ritter. Vaughan plunged his gloved hands into her belly as dark whorls clouded Cordelia's vision, her head aching, exploding in sudden sparkling flashes. The blackness ballooned out, overwhelming her. The last thing she heard was the surgeon's despairing, sibilant voice. "Oh, shit!" Guys, that is just not what you want to hear. Oh my God, they really do need some bait and tech in here, please. Jesus Christ. So she has some really fucked up fever dreams. And finally wakes up, and her husband is here. He's saying, "It's all right." And she's like, "Is it?" I love the way it's written. IZZIT. And he says, "You've been really sick. You had a violent hemorrhage during the transfer. Your heart stopped twice. And then, on top of the poisoning, the trauma flared into soul toxin pneumonia. You had a very bad day yesterday, but you're over the worst of it and you're off the respirator." And she says, "The baby, did it work?" And he says, "It went all right." Vaughan says the transfer was successful. They lost about 30% of the placental function, but are recompensated with an enriched and increased oxy solution flow. And all seems to be well, or as well as can be expected. The baby's still alive anyway. You guys. Oh, God. I have just such a, reaction to medical torture, medical malpractice. I was reading a story recently about somebody they called Dr. Death, who actually worked up here in Frisco, right near where I live. And he was this surgeon who frequently went in drunk and high, and he killed a couple people and rendered several people paralyzed, either full body paralysis or from the waist down, and was straight up doing shit wrong, and nobody was calling him on it. They were not taking him out of the profession. And it's just the way that my stomach was roiling reading this, the idea of being in the hands of somebody who couldn't fucking give a shit. And these people do care, and it's still awful, ugh. And she asks where the baby is, and he points out the research facility. And she's like, "Oh, yeah, the day we collected Elena, I saw that place." And he's like, "Yes." So she falls asleep. We come in for the next morning. They've taken tubes out of her. Things are calming down a little bit. And she's, being walked up and down and just healing. And then Dr. Henri comes in with a float chair, their way cooler version of a wheelchair, and takes her to see the vid scans of the baby moving around and stuff. Their subject's nerves, skin, and eyes tested out encouragingly, though Henri was not so sure about the hearing because of the tiny bones in the ear, which would be interesting, and I wonder how they, I have no doubt the Batons have some kind of tech for people who have problems with their hearing, but God knows what they do here. And then Captain Vaughan comes in, and he has this expression. He just bursts in, and she's like, what's wrong? And she's thinking the baby died. And he's like, we have an issue with Piotr. And her response is, oh, he came to see the baby? Oh, good. And I'm like, girl, do you not fucking hear the tone in his voice? No, it's not good. And he then says, Dr. Henri had the same idea you did. We showed him around the lab and blah, blah, blah. After some beating around the bush, hinting, well, to cut it short, the general first asked, then ordered, then tried to bribe Dr. Henri to open the stopcock and destroy the fetus. The mutation, he calls it. We threw him the hell out. He swore he'd be back. And she starts shaking in response to this, and he's like, you need to keep him the fuck out of here. I don't know what you need to do, but that dude is too high level, and what are we supposed to do in response to this? And she's like, yeah, bet. Let me figure this out. And she goes and gets Aral. He's in the middle of a meeting, and she's like, I don't care. Come now. We need to talk. And she tells him what happened. And she's surprised that Aral isn't, he doesn't have that big a reaction. And she's like, did you know about this? And he's like, yeah, I knew about this. You've been sick and out of it for a week. I've been having to fucking listen to him this whole time. I just, he was arguing with me. I did not argue back. And he then calls in, I wish to speak simultaneously to the Security Chief, Imperial Military Hospital, and Commander Simon Ilian. So they get on. I wish to revoke a security clearance. And he explains his father, denied access building 6 biochemical research, and Ilian is like, he has absolute clearance by Imperial order. I need an Imperial order to countermand it. That's precisely what this is, Ilian. And I was like, yeah, what do you mean, Ilian? Hello? Anybody home? What do you... That felt for me kind of revealing about Ilian's perspective on Vorkosigan, and I don't know if I like that. By my order, Aral Vorkosigan, regent to His Imperial Majesty Gregor Vorbara. Is that official enough? Yes, sir. Understood. Is there anything else? That's all. Just that one building. Sir, what if General Vorkosigan refuses to halt when ordered? If your security people are indeed so overwhelmed by one old man, they may use force up to and including stunner fire. And Ilian is like, he's older, that could potentially kill him maybe, and he's going to be really mad. And Aral just stares him down, and finally he just says, yes, sir, and signs off. And I was like, yeah, enough with this, Ilian. I know that you guys are in close quarters all the time, but I don't feel like y'all are friends like that. Stop it. I don't like it. I'm starting to not trust this guy. I don't like it. So, she asks point blank of Aral, because he's like, I can see both your perspectives. And she's like, yeah, but if the chips are down, who are you going to back? And he says, he is my past. You are my future. The rest of my life belongs to the future. I really like that line, and I really wish that, there's a lot of Am I the Asshole entries on Reddit and various, advice articles littered with people who are deeply influenced by their family to do shit that is just downright disrespectful a lot of the time of their spouse. And, like, I could never. If Owen didn't back me over his family, that's it for me. You know, I didn't marry your family. I married you, and you either have my back or you fucking don't. And that's a wrap for me. So, I like putting it this way. So, finally Cordelia's like, can we get the fuck out of here, actually? Let's go down to Surlo and take a break. It'll be harder for them to get a hold of you, and it'll be just us. And he says, outstanding idea, we'll take the old man along. And I was like, she just said just us. But, of course, the point is to get him away from fucking here. And that is the end of chapter 9. So, very emotional, you guys. This was really rough. I'm very curious to see what happens with the fetus and how that goes. Excuse me. Goodness. I, burped inside my chest. That was very weird. Vicky says, sorry we gave you such a dark batch of episodes for this episode. Or batch of chapters for this episode. Look, it happens sometimes. It'd be like that sometimes. I know. All right, guys. Well, I'm going to wrap it up. Thank you again so much for hanging out with me. Thank you, Jeff, for commissioning this. And until next time, toodaloo, motherfuckers.
That was an Unspoiled Network podcast.